They dreamed of starting a new life and thought they'd found the perfect deal, an old house for an unbelievably low price. But when the young couple went down to the basement, they uncovered something no one was ever meant to see. Subscribe to the channel and comment below. Where are you watching this video from? The summer heat lingered over Atlanta like a heavy curtain the day Marcus and Layla packed the last of their things. The city had been their home for years. Small apartments with thin walls, traffic that never slept, neighbors who came and went like ghosts. But now the echoing rooms behind them felt more like a chapter closing than a place they were leaving. Marcus stood by the open door, wiping the sweat from his forehead as he watched Layla fold the last box of kitchen dishes. Her scrubs were wrinkled from another long shift at the hospital, her eyes tired, but there was something softer in her expression that morning. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of it. They had talked about owning a home since the week they were married. For Marcus, it had always been a promise he carried like a tool in his belt, something practical, something earned. He worked as an electrician, driving from site to site across the city, patching wires, fixing short circuits, crawling under buildings and up into attics until his hands were cracked and lined with scars. Layla, always the steady one, had supported them both through years of rent and saving, her hospital paychecks never quite stretching far enough. They knew what they wanted: a porch, a little yard, maybe a quiet street where no sirens wailed at night. But it always seemed just beyond reach. Then, one evening, after another shift that ended past midnight, Marcus sat scrolling through property listings while Layla dozed beside him on the couch. He wasn't looking for anything serious. He did this every week, half as a dream, half as a way to unwind. But that night, a headline caught his eye. Old family home in Pine Hollow, quick sale, needs work. The photos were grainy, the walls cracked, the floors warped, yet the price was almost unbelievable, less than half of anything else in the area. The listing mentioned that the previous owner had passed away, leaving no heirs, and that the local bank was handling the sale to clear the estate. Marcus stared at the screen for a long time before nudging Layla awake. She frowned, blinking at the dim light. "What time is it?" "Late," Marcus said, "but look at this." He handed her the phone. She studied the images, scrolling slowly. The place didn't look like much. An old two-story farmhouse with peeling white paint, surrounded by knee-high weeds and a leaning wooden fence. But there was something about it that felt real, almost waiting. "It's too cheap," she murmured. "There has to be a catch." "Maybe," Marcus said. "But what if it's just forgotten?" Layla didn't answer. She was cautious by nature, her thoughts steady and deliberate, while Marcus was driven by a kind of faith in his own hands, the belief that anything broken could be fixed. He promised her they'd drive out on Saturday just to see. The road to Pine Hollow wound through fields and clusters of pines that shimmered in the sunlight. The closer they came to the town, the quieter it grew, until the highway narrowed into a two-lane road lined with weathered signs and empty storefronts. The house stood a few miles beyond the town limits, up a gravel drive shaded by oaks. It looked almost abandoned, its roof missing a few shingles, the porch railing sagging, the windows clouded with dust. Yet, beneath the neglect, Layla felt something, an undercurrent of warmth, as if the place still remembered laughter, footsteps, the smell of cooking, all the small things that made it once alive. Marcus stepped up to the porch and pressed his hand against one of the wooden beams. The wood felt solid. "She's old," he said quietly, "but she's still standing." Inside, the air was cool and still. Dust floated in the sunlight slanting through the windows. They wandered through the rooms, high ceilings, wide doorways, a fireplace blackened with soot. The wallpaper peeled in strips like old skin, revealing older paint beneath. In one corner of the dining room, Layla found a photograph lying face down. She picked it up carefully. A black and white portrait of a man and a woman, both dressed in Sunday clothes, smiling faintly, their hands almost touching. The glass frame was cracked, but the image was clear. She turned it over and read the faint name written in pencil on the back. The Caldwells, 1956. Something about the name lingered in her mind as they moved from room to room. On the second floor, the sunlight filtered through lace curtains that had yellowed with time. A child's room stood half empty, an iron bed frame, a shelf with a broken toy car, a scattering of marbles across the floor. The quiet was heavy, but not cold. Layla imagined how it must have felt to live here once, to wake to the smell of morning rain and the creak of the stairs, to open the front door and see nothing but fields and sky. When they stepped outside again, Marcus was already calculating repairs. Roof needs patching. Plumbing's probably shot, but the foundation looks good, he said. We could make this work. Layla shaded her eyes against the sun. The wind rustled through the grass and carried the faint scent of wildflowers. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. If we do this, she said, we do it together. That evening, they signed the papers at a small office downtown. The real estate agent, an older man with silver hair and a distracted smile, mentioned that the house had belonged to a local photographer who disappeared in the late 1960s. Most folks say he moved north, the man added, shrugging. Never came back. Place sat empty for years after that. They didn't think much of it then. There was too much excitement in the air, too much of that feeling that comes when you cross a threshold you've dreamed about for too long. Driving back to the city, the road stretched ahead like a promise. Layla leaned her head against the window, watching the last light fade through the trees. When they returned a week later, the house was theirs. They parked the truck beside the porch, carried in boxes, and began to clean. The first few days were filled with the smell of soap, the sound of sweeping, the scrape of furniture being moved. Every corner they touched seemed to breathe again. Marcus replaced old wiring, testing the circuits, while Layla scrubbed cabinets and washed windows until the rooms glowed with sunlight. At night, they ate dinner on the floor because they hadn't yet unpacked the table. They talked about painting the living room blue, planting roses by the porch, fixing the fence. There was a sense of peace that neither of them had felt in years. For the first time, the silence around them wasn't loneliness. It was rest. But there were also hints of something else. Little things, barely noticeable. The faint smell of metal in the basement when Marcus checked the fuse box. The way the light flickered slightly whenever he turned on the kitchen switch, as if the house was trying to speak in its own electrical language. And the photograph Layla had found, the Caldwells, still rested on the mantel, watching over them. One evening, after finishing a long day of repairs, Marcus sat on the porch steps, looking out toward the yard. The sun had dropped behind the trees, painting the sky a deep orange. The land stretched quiet and still, the old oak tree at the far end casting a long shadow over the grass. Layla joined him, resting her head on his shoulder. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "This place feels different," she said softly. Marcus nodded. "Yeah, like it's waiting for us to remember something." He didn't know what he meant by that, not yet, but somewhere in the quiet between them, the old house seemed to breathe, as though something within its walls had been sleeping for years, and now, with their arrival, had finally stirred. The night air cooled. Crickets began to sing. The windows of their new home glimmered faintly in the darkness, reflecting the stars. Inside, the faint hum of electricity ran through the wires Marcus had repaired that morning, following invisible paths through the old wood and plaster. It sounded almost like a heartbeat, steady, patient, alive, and though neither of them could have known it yet, that quiet pulse beneath the floorboards was leading them toward something buried, something that waited beneath their very feet. The house, for all its stillness, was not empty. It carried the weight of memory, the echo of a name written long ago, and the faint whisper of a story that was only beginning to unfold. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the kind of morning that settles quietly over the countryside before the heat begins to rise. Marcus woke early, long before Layla stirred, and stood by the bedroom window, staring out at the yard. Mist hovered low over the grass, softening the edges of the world. The oak tree at the far end of the property stood like an old sentinel, its branches still heavy with dew. There was a strange calmness to it all, too still, too expectant, as if the house and land were holding their breath. He didn't yet understand why, but even as he dressed and headed downstairs, he felt an odd pull toward the basement door. The house had been quiet through the night. A little too quiet, Marcus thought. No creaking, no settling, no wind against the windows, just a deep, thick silence. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the thermos they'd brought with them, the bitter scent filling the kitchen, and stood for a while by the counter, tracing the patterns in the cracked tile. Layla appeared soon after, barefoot, her hair tied back, still wearing his old t-shirt. She smiled sleepily at him, and for a moment the world was simple again. They began the day's work with energy. There was so much to do that neither had time to sit still. Marcus hauled the broken furniture out to the porch, while Layla tackled the kitchen, washing down the cabinets, cleaning grime from the walls. The air filled with the smell of bleach and old wood, the scrape of brooms and the rustle of dust. Every now and then they'd stop and laugh, teasing each other about their discoveries. A rusted iron key found in a drawer, a child's marble that rolled out from under the refrigerator, a newspaper from 1961 tucked behind the stove. It felt like uncovering layers of someone else's life, piece by piece, and though most of what they found was useless junk, there was a strange intimacy in touching what others had left behind. By midday, the sunlight grew fierce, spilling through the windows in thick gold beams that illuminated the dust still floating in the air. Marcus decided to start on the wiring, something he'd been meaning to check since they moved in. Old houses were tricky. Half of them held surprises hidden in their walls, and not all of them good. He gathered his tools, a flashlight, and made his way down the narrow steps to the basement. The basement was different from the rest of the house. It felt older, somehow untouched by the years that had reshaped the rooms above. The air was cooler, damp, and heavy with the scent of rust and soil. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and somewhere in the dark, a slow drip echoed like a clock ticking underwater. Marcus set down his flashlight and swept it across the walls. Concrete, rough and stained, lined with old shelving. A broken chair lay collapsed near the center, and an overturned crate spilled out yellowed papers. He crouched by the fuse box to inspect it. Most of the wiring was ancient, cloth-insulated cables that had long outlived their time, but something caught his attention almost immediately. Along the far wall, half hidden behind an old dresser, ran a line of thick black cables. They were newer than everything else in the basement. Too new, in fact. Smooth insulation, modern clamps, no dust. Someone had installed them recently, but the rest of the house hadn't seen a repair in decades. Marcus frowned and followed the line with his eyes. The cables ran straight along the wall, tight and purposeful, disappearing into a rough hole in the concrete near the corner. It looked like someone had drilled through deliberately, sealing it afterward with a patch of plaster that had since begun to crack. He touched the surface and felt the cool air faintly seeping through. Behind it, there was something else. Open space, maybe, or the ground outside. He stood for a long moment, the low hum of the old refrigerator upstairs faintly audible through the floorboards, and felt again that strange sense of expectation. He returned upstairs to tell Layla what he'd found, but she was kneeling by the living room fireplace, scrubbing at soot-stained bricks. Her face was flushed, strands of hair sticking to her temples, but she was smiling. "You should see what I found," she said, holding up a folded newspaper, brittle and brown with age. The headline was barely legible, but one name stood out. Caldwell Photography Studio closes after fire. The article mentioned a small shop that once stood in Pine Hollow, owned by a man named James Caldwell. Marcus remembered the photograph they had found the day before, the couple in Sunday clothes, their hands almost touching. He told her about the cables, about how new they looked, how they disappeared through the basement wall. Layla's brow furrowed, but she didn't seem alarmed. "Probably something from the old power lines," she said. "Or maybe someone used it for storage." "Maybe," Marcus replied, though the words didn't sit right. He'd rewired enough houses to know what old power lines looked like, and these weren't them. Whoever had put them there had done so intentionally, and not that long ago. They spent the rest of the day cleaning, but Marcus's mind kept returning to the basement. The more he thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Why would someone go through the trouble of running modern cables through an old wall and then burying them behind plaster? By late afternoon, curiosity outweighed reason. He grabbed his flashlight again and returned downstairs. The light flickered as he descended. He moved the dresser aside, brushed away dust, and examined the cracked plaster patch more closely. Behind it, faint marks showed where a tool had chipped away at the surface. Someone had worked quickly. He tapped the area and heard a hollow echo. Not solid earth, something beyond. He hesitated only a second before taking a screwdriver from his belt and prying at the edge. The plaster crumbled easily, revealing a narrow hole wide enough to slip a few fingers through. Cool air rushed out, carrying the scent of dirt and something faintly metallic. When he shined the flashlight inside, he saw the black cables stretching out into the dark, vanishing into the soil on the other side. There was no visible connection, no reason for them to be there. His first instinct was to follow them outside, to see where they led, but the daylight was fading fast. He'd wait until morning. That night, the house seemed to creak more than usual. The wind had picked up, brushing against the walls, making the trees groan. Layla fell asleep easily, exhaustion dragging her down, but Marcus lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling. He kept thinking about the cables, about how deliberately they had been placed, about how the basement had felt. Quiet, too quiet, as if it was holding something beneath its stillness. At some point, he drifted off, but his dreams were strange and heavy. He dreamed of the oak tree. In the dream, it was larger than before, its roots spreading through the ground like veins, pulsing faintly with light. He saw the black cables tangled among them, merging with the roots, snaking downward into the earth. Somewhere in the distance, he heard a low hum, steady, rhythmic, almost alive. When he woke, the first pale light of morning was spilling through the curtains, and Layla was already sitting at the edge of the bed, her expression distant. "I had a weird dream," she said quietly before he could speak, "about the tree." Marcus stared at her. "The oak?" She nodded, rubbing her arms as though the memory chilled her. It felt like it was breathing. Neither of them laughed. They both knew it was just a dream, but the coincidence left an uneasiness between them that lingered through breakfast. Marcus told her he wanted to follow the cables outside, just to be sure there wasn't something unsafe buried near the house. She agreed, though he could see she wasn't thrilled by the idea. Before heading out, Marcus went down once more to the basement. The air felt even heavier than before, the kind of heaviness that doesn't come from humidity, but from time itself. He could almost hear the faint buzz of electricity through the cables, though he knew there was no current running through them. It was imagination, he told himself, the brain making sense of silence. Outside, the yard shimmered with morning light. Dew glistened on the weeds, and the air smelled of earth and pine. He traced the wall of the house until he found where the cables emerged, a bundle of black lines running just above the foundation, disappearing into the grass. Layla followed, her shoes brushing through the wet blades as they walked slowly toward the back fence. The cables continued across the garden, half buried, leading straight toward the oak tree. They stopped a few feet away from it. The cables vanished beneath the soil there, right at the base of the trunk, near an old, half-rotted stump beside it. Marcus crouched, pressing his hand to the ground. The earth felt cool, softer than it should have been. He looked up at Layla. "Whatever's down there, it's not natural." She crossed her arms, her voice low. "Do you think it's dangerous?" "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I'm going to find out." He rose and glanced toward the small shed near the fence, its door hanging crooked on its hinges. Inside, among old paint cans and garden tools, he found 2 shovels. The metal was rusted, the handles splintered, but they'd do. Layla hesitated for a moment before taking one from him. There was a brief, almost wordless understanding between them. Something had been hidden here, maybe for a long time, and now they were the ones meant to uncover it. The first thrust of the shovel cut into the earth with a sound like tearing cloth. Soil and roots gave way under the metal blade. The sun climbed higher as they dug, sweat running down their arms, the smell of wet dirt thick in the air. Inch by inch, they followed the cables deeper, tracing them through the soil. It was exhausting work, but neither wanted to stop. By the time the shadows lengthened again, they had dug several feet down. Marcus's shovel struck something hard, sending a vibration up the handle that made his fingers sting. He froze. Layla leaned closer, brushing away loose dirt with her gloved hands until the edge of a flat surface appeared. Metal, corroded but unmistakably solid. They exchanged a look. The cables ran directly into it. Marcus exhaled slowly, heart hammering. "Looks like we found our answer." Layla said nothing. Her hands trembled as she cleared more of the soil, revealing a corner, then a handle, rusted nearly through but still intact. It was a box, large, heavy, and deeply buried. The kind of thing someone had wanted to hide, not store. The evening sun dipped low, streaking the yard in gold and red. Around them, the crickets had begun to sing, their chirping rising and falling like a steady breath. The cables, half buried in the ground, seemed to disappear into the metal surface, swallowed by it. Marcus leaned back on his heels, staring at the box. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lay inside it was older than the cables themselves, that they had been added later, like veins grafted onto something already alive. Layla stood beside him, silent, her eyes fixed on the dirt-streaked surface. The air around them was still. Even the wind had quieted. The oak tree loomed above, its branches dark against the fading light, as if listening. For the first time since they'd moved in, Marcus felt something stir deep in his chest, a mix of fear and wonder, a recognition that the ground beneath their new home was not as simple as it seemed. The house had waited years for their arrival, and now, it seemed, the earth itself was beginning to speak. Neither of them knew that the day's digging was only the beginning, that the cables, the box, and the name on that old photograph were all threads of the same story, woven long before they were born. But as the last light faded behind the trees, both Marcus and Layla understood one thing clearly. Whatever they had uncovered, it would not stay buried for long. The sun rose slowly over Pine Hollow, a pale disk half veiled in haze, and the yard of the old house glistened with dew. Marcus woke before dawn, restless and uneasy after a night of broken sleep. The image of the metal box beneath the soil had followed him through every dream, turning the night into a restless blur of digging, whispers, and shifting shadows under the oak tree. When he opened his eyes, Layla was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, the light from the window tracing faint gold across her skin. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence between them was no longer comfortable. It carried the weight of discovery. By the time the morning air began to warm, Marcus was outside, shovel in hand, his boots sinking into the damp earth. The patch of ground they had unearthed the previous evening looked darker now, a wide wound in the grass that smelled of soil and rust. Layla brought him coffee in a thermos, her expression cautious. She wasn't sure whether to encourage him or stop him. There was something about the whole thing that unsettled her, though she couldn't have said exactly what. The cables still disappeared into the ground, vanishing beneath the layer of dirt that remained over the box. It was as though the land itself was protecting it, refusing to yield too easily. Marcus began to dig again. The metal clinked and scraped against the edges, sending sharp sounds echoing through the still morning. Every now and then he paused, leaning on the handle, catching his breath. The box was large, larger than he had first thought, and its corners were deeply embedded. Layla knelt beside him, brushing the soil away with her hands, the dirt caking under her nails. Neither of them said much. The rhythm of their shovels filled the silence. After an hour, the full shape of the box emerged. It was rectangular, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, the metal dark with rust. One side was dented, the hinges barely visible beneath the corrosion. The black cables ran directly into a small hole near the base, their ends fused into the metal as if welded. Marcus crouched beside it, examining the surface. There was no lock, no writing, no clue about what it might contain. "It's heavy," Layla murmured, touching the edge. Her voice trembled slightly. Marcus nodded. He didn't know why, but the sight of it made him shiver. It wasn't just the age or the decay. It was the feeling that they had uncovered something meant to stay hidden. Still, curiosity burned brighter than fear. Together, they cleared more of the surrounding soil until they could slide their hands beneath one edge. The box refused to move at first, but with effort, grunting, straining, dirt clinging to their arms, they managed to lift it just enough to shift it out of the hole. The sound it made when it hit the ground above was deep and final, like the closing of a door. Layla stepped back, brushing her hair from her face, her chest rising and falling quickly. The box lay in the morning light, streaked with mud, droplets of moisture gleaming on its surface. For a long time, neither of them moved. Finally, Marcus stood and wiped his palms on his jeans. "Let's open it." The words hung between them. Layla hesitated, then nodded. She could feel the tension in the air, the same kind of charged stillness that comes before a storm. Marcus crouched again, slipping his fingers under the edge of the lid. It didn't budge. He tried again, pulling harder until the old metal groaned in protest. The hinges cracked slightly, flakes of rust breaking loose. With one final heave, the lid came open, the noise echoing through the quiet yard like a breath released after decades. The smell that rose from the box was damp and earthy, mixed with something faintly chemical, like old film stock. Inside lay several bundles wrapped tightly in faded canvas, each tied with frayed string. They were arranged neatly, side by side, as though someone had placed them there with care. Marcus reached for the nearest one and paused. "Wait," Layla said softly. "We don't know what's in there." He looked at her, then back at the bundle. "That's why we're going to find out." He untied the string and peeled back the fabric. A fine dust rose into the air, glittering in the sunlight. Inside was a smaller object, metallic and compact. When he lifted it out, Layla realized it was a camera, an old one, square-bodied with twin lenses and a cracked leather strap. The name engraved on the side was almost worn away, but she could make out the letters, Rolleiflex. There were several more cameras beneath it, along with small boxes of film reels, envelopes, and thick packets wrapped in brown paper. Each envelope was marked with faded handwriting, dates, locations, brief descriptions. Selma, 1965. Montgomery March. Freedom Riders. The words stirred something deep in Layla's chest. She knelt beside Marcus and reached for one of the envelopes, careful not to tear it. Inside were strips of negatives, each one darkened by age, but still intact. She held them up to the light, and for a moment, faint images appeared. Crowds, signs, faces mid-shout, arms raised. It was as though time itself had been preserved in those tiny rectangles of film. Marcus exhaled slowly. Whoever this was, they documented everything. Layla spread another cloth bundle open and found a small notebook tucked among the rolls of film. The cover was soft with wear, the pages warped from moisture. Inside, written in delicate, lupin handwriting, were brief notes, lists of places, names, dates, fragments of thoughts. At the top of the first page, in bold ink, was a name: James Caldwell. Layla stared at it. The same name that had appeared in the newspaper. The same name written on the back of the photograph she'd found inside the house. She flipped through more pages. Each one seemed to record moments in history. Some entries were only a few words long. Birmingham, March 17th. Police broke the line, caught the look in her eyes. Others were more detailed, describing the mood, the fear, the hope. It dawned on both of them that they weren't holding just old photographs. They were holding a piece of history. The images and notes, the film and the cameras, all pointed to the life of a man who had witnessed things that shaped the world, only to vanish without a trace. They brought the bundles into the house, spreading them across the kitchen table. Sunlight poured through the windows, casting golden rectangles over the relics. The air seemed charged, alive with the presence of something larger than themselves. Marcus carefully flipped through more envelopes, each revealing glimpses of people in motion, crowds locked in moments of passion and defiance. The faces were expressive, some shouting, others weeping, some simply standing still, looking directly into the lens as if they knew this image would outlive them. Layla found herself trembling. "These could be from the civil rights movement," she whispered. Marcus nodded slowly, still staring at the photographs. "If they're real, if they're what they look like, this could be important." They spent hours cataloging what they could without disturbing the fragile materials too much. Layla read aloud more entries from the notebook, tracing Caldwell's handwriting with her fingertip. There were mentions of marches in Selma, of leaders by name, some famous, some forgotten, and even personal reflections, quiet and haunted. Sometimes I wonder if these images will ever be seen. Maybe not now, but someday someone will find them, and maybe they'll understand what it cost. The words sent a chill through both of them. Layla looked toward the window, where the oak tree's shadow stretched across the yard. "He buried this here," she said. "He wanted it to survive." Marcus felt a strange ache in his chest. The thought of a man hiding his life's work beneath the soil, trusting the earth to guard it for decades, stirred something deep inside him. He imagined Caldwell in this very yard, digging by lantern light, sweat dripping down his face, the fear of discovery sharp in his chest. What had driven him to hide it? What danger had forced him to bury not just his work, but his story? As the afternoon light began to fade, Layla gathered the envelopes back into the box. "We should take these somewhere," she said, "to someone who knows how to handle them properly." Marcus agreed, though part of him was reluctant to let them go. It felt as though the house itself had given them a gift, a secret entrusted to their care. When they carried the box back down to the basement for safekeeping, the air felt different, lighter somehow, though still tinged with mystery. That night, over dinner, neither of them spoke much. The sound of cicadas filled the air outside, their steady rhythm mingling with the faint hum of electricity in the walls. The photograph of the Caldwells still stood on the mantel, and now it seemed to watch them differently, almost knowingly. Later, when they went to bed, Layla lay awake, listening to the sounds of the house. She thought of the faces she had seen in those negatives, faces filled with courage, fear, conviction. She thought of James Caldwell, of the words he had written, of the choice to bury his truth rather than risk it being lost or destroyed. She turned toward Marcus, who was already half asleep, and whispered, "Maybe this house chose us." He didn't answer, but his hand found hers in the dark, warm and steady. Outside, the oak tree swayed gently in the night breeze. Its roots reached deep, curling through the layers of earth, brushing against the space where the box had lain for decades. The cables, the soil, the house, all of it seemed connected, part of a single silent memory stretching through time. In that quiet, something shifted. The past had begun to wake, not with noise or movement, but with presence, a slow, almost imperceptible stirring, like breath drawn after years of silence. And as sleep finally took them both, the house stood watch, holding its secrets close, waiting for the day when they would be fully uncovered. The morning after their discovery was overcast and cool, the kind of morning that felt heavy before the first word was spoken. Layla woke first. For a long while she lay still, staring at the ceiling, the faint creaks of the old house echoing through the silence. Somewhere beneath her feet, in the basement, the metal box waited, cleaned, set aside, and yet somehow still a presence in the house, like a sleeping animal under the floorboards. She felt it, that quiet pull of unfinished business, as she rose and wrapped a sweater around her shoulders. Marcus was already downstairs. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen, rich and grounding, but even that comfort could not erase the tension between them. He was sitting at the table with the notebook open in front of him, a small stack of the photographs beside it. His eyes were distant, as if still half buried in the pages. When he looked up at her, there was a quiet certainty in his face. "I think we need to go through all of it," he said softly. "Every roll, every page." Layla nodded, though she wasn't sure she was ready. Part of her was afraid of what they might uncover, afraid of the history now resting in their hands. The air in the house felt different since they had brought the contents of the box upstairs. It wasn't haunted, exactly, but charged, like the pause before thunder. They spent the morning at the table, spreading out the envelopes and reels across a towel to protect the wood. Each item was handled carefully, as though one careless breath might erase decades of memory. The negatives were still damp from the soil, so Layla placed them one by one on the cloth, letting the air dry them. Marcus, with hands that usually handled wire and voltage, now moved with surprising gentleness, brushing away flecks of dirt and rust from the camera bodies. Every so often, he'd test a knob or gently press a shutter, listening to the faint click that still, miraculously, sounded after all those years. The notebook proved to be the key. It wasn't just a list of dates and places. It was a chronicle of a man's witness to an era that had nearly consumed him. The first pages described peaceful marches, the hope of new beginnings, the strength of unity. But as the pages turned, the tone darkened. Notes became fragmented, sentences cut short. Words like raid, threats, burned, and gone began to repeat. Layla read one line aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. They said the studio was a target. I took what I could. The rest went to ash. Marcus's jaw tightened. The fire in the newspaper, he said. He must have buried what survived. Layla looked at the date at the bottom of the page, May 1966, and realized that what they held wasn't just forgotten art. It was evidence of someone's courage and maybe someone's fear. They continued reading. There were names, some familiar from history, others unknown. Addresses written in pencil, most crossed out. In the margins, Caldwell had scribbled thoughts that seemed almost like confessions. The truth has to outlive me. It has to. And then later, if I cannot show them, maybe the earth will keep it safe. Outside, the sky darkened. Rain began to fall, tapping gently against the windows, its rhythm steady and soothing. The sound filled the silence between them as they worked. The old house seemed to listen too, its walls absorbing the weight of the past that had been brought to light. By afternoon, the rain had turned into a downpour. Thunder rolled in the distance. Layla sat by the window with the notebook in her lap while Marcus examined one of the film canisters. There's still film inside, he said, holding it up to the light. It's probably too damaged to use, but if it isn't... He trailed off, the thought unfinished. If it wasn't, they might be holding never-before-seen images of history, faces and places that existed now only in memories and archives. The weight of that realization was enormous. As a storm rumbled, Layla opened to a page she hadn't read before. The handwriting was rushed, the ink smudged as though written in fear. They came to the studio again, said I was stirring trouble. I told them truth can't be burned. They said truth bleeds too. I have to go, burying what's left near the oak. Her hands trembled as she read the words aloud. Marcus stared at her, and in that moment, they both understood. This wasn't just coincidence. The oak tree in their yard wasn't random. It was the very one Caldwell had written about. The earth beneath it had guarded his life's work for half a century, hidden until they arrived. They were quiet for a long time after that. The rain softened to a drizzle, and the house grew dim. Layla ran her fingers across the page, feeling the grooves left by the man's hand, imagining him writing those words by candlelight, glancing over his shoulder, terrified. She wondered what had become of him. Did he ever come back for the box? Did anyone know where he'd gone? As evening settled in, Marcus lit the small lamp on the table. Its glow spilled across the pages, casting a warm circle of light in the gathering darkness. "We should tell someone," he said finally. "A museum, maybe, or a university. They'll know how to handle it." Layla hesitated. "You think that's what he wanted?" Marcus looked at her. He wanted it remembered. He didn't bury it to keep it hidden forever. He buried it so someone could find it when it was safe. His words hung in the air, solid and undeniable. Still, part of Layla felt uneasy. The discovery was theirs, something that had come to them as if chosen. Handing it over so soon felt like letting go of a promise not yet fulfilled. Later that night, after dinner, they carried the box back downstairs, not to hide it again, but to keep it safe from the damp air. The basement felt less menacing now, more solemn, as if aware of its role in the story. They placed the box on an old wooden table and covered it with a clean sheet. The hum of the storm outside echoed faintly through the walls. When they turned to leave, Layla glanced once more at the cables running along the wall. They still looked too new, out of place against the cracked concrete. "Why do you think someone ran those?" she asked. Marcus followed her gaze. Maybe someone else knew about this. Maybe they were trying to find it too. The thought unsettled them both. He checked the circuit panel again, tracing the cables with his flashlight. They led into the same opening as before. The hole Caldwell might have used decades ago, but the wires themselves were modern, insulated, and intact. Someone had added them later. It raised questions Marcus didn't yet know how to answer. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to the house breathe. Every small sound, the settling wood, the faint drip of water in the basement, seemed magnified. He got up quietly and went downstairs. The living room was shadowed, the moonlight cutting pale stripes across the floor. The photograph of the Caldwells still stood on the mantel, catching a sliver of light on the glass. He went to the window and looked out. The yard was silvered in moonlight, the oak tree standing tall at the far end, its leaves shimmering faintly in the breeze. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw movement. Something small near the base of the trunk, a shift of shadow, or perhaps just his imagination. He told himself it was nothing, that his mind was playing tricks on him after everything they had uncovered. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't finished, that there was still something buried beyond the physical, something waiting to be remembered fully. In the morning, the world felt washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving the air bright and sharp. Layla joined him on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. They sat in silence, the calm between them easy again for the first time in days. The discovery had changed something fundamental in both of them, not just their sense of history, but their place in it. They were no longer just homeowners or wanderers looking for peace. They were witnesses, entrusted with the legacy of a man who had believed that truth could survive if it was protected long enough. When the breeze lifted, carrying the scent of damp earth, Marcus looked toward the oak tree and thought of the line from Caldwell's notebook. "If I cannot show them, maybe the earth will keep it safe." The earth had done its part. Now it was their turn. That evening, they packed a few of the photographs and the notebook into a canvas bag. The rest they left carefully stored in the basement. They planned to visit the town library the next day, maybe find records about Caldwell, perhaps even locate someone who remembered him. The anticipation felt heavy but right, as though they were following a path laid decades before they were born. Before bed, Layla went to the kitchen window one last time. The yard lay quiet, bathed in the faint glow of the porch light. The oak tree stood as it always had, unmoving, its roots deep in the soil that had kept it secret for so long. She pressed her hand against the glass, a silent gesture of gratitude to the man who had trusted the ground with his truth. Upstairs, Marcus turned off the lights. The house settled into darkness, the hum of the wires fading into stillness. Yet, beneath that silence, the faintest trace of energy remained, the presence of history breathing softly in the corners, alive in the air between the walls. The metal box no longer seemed like an object but a vessel, one that had carried not only images but something intangible, the courage of memory. Outside, a gentle wind moved through the branches of the oak, stirring the leaves so that they whispered faintly to the night. It was not a lonely sound. It was the sound of something old awakening again, carried forward by two people who, without knowing it, had been chosen to uncover it. And though the world beyond their small yard slept unaware, the past was alive once more in the house that remembered. The next morning arrived with a crisp, golden light that poured gently through the kitchen windows, softening the edges of the night that had come before. The air still smelled faintly of rain and old wood. Layla sat at the table with her coffee untouched, staring at the small canvas bag that held the photographs and notebook. Marcus was standing by the counter, adjusting his tool belt out of habit, though he wasn't going to work that day. Both of them knew that the house had changed them in ways they couldn't yet name. What had begun as a restoration project had become something deeper, something heavier, an inheritance of memory that neither of them had expected to receive. When they finally stepped outside, the morning was still. The gravel crunched beneath their boots as they made their way to the truck. The town of Pine Hollow was only a short drive away, but it felt like crossing a boundary, from the quiet solitude of their house into the wider world where their discovery might finally be seen. Marcus drove slowly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his hands steady but his mind racing. Layla held the bag close to her chest, her fingers tracing the worn edge of the notebook through the canvas as though afraid it might vanish if she let go. Pine Hollow's main street was small and lined with low brick buildings that looked unchanged for decades. A diner, a barber shop, an old post office, and, at the end of the block, the town library, a square building of faded red brick, with ivy climbing the walls and the faint scent of dust and paper lingering in the air. Inside, the cool quiet wrapped around them as they stepped through the door. The librarian, an older woman with gray hair pulled tightly into a bun, looked up from behind the counter. Her expression was curious but kind. "Good morning," she said. "Can I help you?" Layla hesitated before speaking. "We're looking for information about a man named James Caldwell. He was a photographer who lived here, maybe in the 1950s or 60s. The woman adjusted her glasses, thinking, James Caldwell. She turned toward an old filing cabinet in the corner, her steps unhurried, as if the rhythm of decades of quiet work had taught her to move at the same pace as the past itself. "We have some town records, newspaper archives, maybe even old directories. You're welcome to look." They followed her to a long wooden table where she set down a stack of bound folders. Marcus opened the first one, and the smell of aged paper rose into the air. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but the headlines still carried echoes of forgotten lives. They spent hours sifting through the archives, small-town announcements, obituaries, community events. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that Layla found a name. Her voice trembled slightly as she read aloud. James Caldwell, local photographer and owner of Caldwell Photography Studio on Elm Street, known for his portraits and community documentation. The article was from 1962. It included a grainy black and white photograph of a man with a camera slung around his neck, standing beside a sign that bore his name. His eyes were sharp, alive, confident. As they turned more pages, the story began to emerge in fragments. Mentions of Caldwell photographing protests, meetings, marches in nearby towns. Then came darker reports, fire, vandalism, accusations. One headline from 1966 read, "Local photographer missing after studio blaze." The short piece described a fire that destroyed the building and all known materials inside. No body had been found. Authorities assumed he'd left town, but no trace was ever discovered. Layla felt a chill as she traced the lines of the photograph. "He didn't leave," she said softly. "He stayed here. He buried it all." Marcus leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied the photo. The man's face was familiar in a way that unsettled him, something in the posture, the look of quiet determination. He remembered the notebook's words. They came again. "I told them truth can't be burned." They thanked the librarian and left the library just as the afternoon sun began to sink lower in the sky. Outside, Pine Hollow looked almost deserted, the air heavy with the scent of summer heat and dust. They walked past the diner, where a few older men sat by the window watching them with idle curiosity, and turned down a side street that led to Elm. What remained of the old studio was little more than a crumbling foundation and a tangle of vines. The building had been gone for decades, replaced by nothing. Yet, when they stood there, the air seemed charged, as if the ground still remembered the sound of shutters clicking, voices shouting, and flames consuming wood and film. Layla knelt by the remains of a brick wall, her hand brushing across the surface. Beneath the dirt, she could see the faint outline of a letter, C, carved into one of the bricks. It was all that was left of his name. They stayed there until dusk, the shadows lengthening over the ruins. Neither spoke. It was Marcus who finally broke the silence. "He didn't disappear," he said quietly. "He just became part of the story." Back at the house that evening, the atmosphere felt different. The rooms seemed to hum faintly, not with menace but with energy, like a current running through the walls. Layla set the notebook on the dining table, turning to a page they hadn't read yet. The handwriting was weaker here, shakier, as though written in haste or exhaustion. "They say I see too much. But how can I turn away when the truth is looking straight into the lens?" She read the next line silently to herself before speaking it aloud. "If they find me, I want them to know I tried, that I loved this place, this fight, these people. The light always finds a way through." Tears welled in her eyes. She looked at Marcus, and for a long moment they didn't need to speak. The words were simple, but they carried an entire life inside them. A man's purpose, his sacrifice, his belief that what he saw mattered enough to risk everything for. The following day, they reached out to a local historian named Samuel Reed, who lived just outside town and had written several books on the civil rights era in Georgia. He invited them to bring the materials to his home, a small farmhouse filled with shelves of books and boxes of papers. When Marcus placed the notebook on his desk, Reed froze. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the cover and read the name inside. "I've been searching for this man's work for 20 years," he said quietly. James Caldwell was a ghost in every record, a photographer everyone mentioned but no one could prove existed. Some said his images were myths, that he'd made them up. Others said they'd been destroyed. Marcus explained how they had found the box, the cables, the oak tree. Reed listened intently, his face a mixture of awe and reverence. He examined the negatives carefully, holding each to the light, his breath catching when he recognized scenes that had only ever been described in second-hand accounts, the faces of marchers, local leaders, families standing outside burned churches. "These aren't just photographs," he said. "They're missing pages of history." Over the next few hours, they worked together, cataloging the items, separating what was salvageable from what was too fragile to move. Reed promised to contact the Georgia Historical Society and several museums that specialized in archival preservation. "This could change how people remember those years," he said. "And you too, you've given this back to the world." When they left his house, the sun was setting behind the fields, casting long golden streaks over the road. Marcus drove in silence, his hands loose on the wheel. Layla stared out the window, her thoughts tangled in everything they'd learned. The name James Caldwell no longer felt like a stranger's. It had become a thread woven into their own lives. She imagined him standing with his camera in the heat of a march, eyes fixed on the world, knowing that each frame might be his last act of witness. By the time they returned home, night had fallen. The air was cool, the sky thick with stars. The house looked peaceful, almost glowing in the moonlight. Layla placed the bag with the remaining items on the table, then walked to the window. The oak tree stood still at the edge of the yard, its branches catching the starlight like silver veins. She thought about the man who had stood beneath it 50 years earlier, bearing his life's work with trembling hands, trusting the earth to keep it safe. Marcus came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "We did the right thing," he said. "I know," she whispered, "but I keep thinking, why us? Why now?" "Maybe because we listened," he said simply. Outside, a soft wind stirred the grass. Somewhere deep in the soil, where the roots of the oak reached like fingers through the dark, the earth held its silence. But it was no longer the silence of forgetting. It was the silence of something preserved, something honored. Later that night, as they prepared for bed, Layla found herself drawn once more to the notebook. She opened it to the very last page. The handwriting was faint, almost erased by time. "If you are reading this, it means the light has survived. Do not let it fade again." She closed the book gently and pressed it to her chest. In that quiet room, surrounded by the hum of the house and the whispers of the past, she felt a calm she hadn't known before. It wasn't just relief, it was gratitude. Gratitude for the man who had seen the world through his lens, for the ground that had guarded his memory, and for the chance to carry his truth forward. When she turned off the lamp, the darkness was soft, almost welcoming. The storm that had hung over their lives since the day they'd first stepped into the basement had lifted. The past had found its way back into the light, and though there were still questions left unanswered, the answers no longer mattered as much. What mattered was that the story had been heard. Outside, the oak tree swayed gently in the wind, its leaves whispering through the night. The cables that once led to the buried box now lay quiet, their purpose fulfilled. The house stood watch as it always had, holding within its walls the echoes of footsteps, voices, and the click of a camera shutter from long ago. And somewhere, perhaps beyond time, the photographer himself might have smiled, knowing that the truth he'd entrusted to the earth had finally been found and remembered. For days after their meeting with Samuel Reed, the house seemed filled with a new kind of stillness, a contemplative quiet, not empty, but watchful, as though it were listening to the story being told about it. The air in the rooms had changed. Even the light that came through the windows in the mornings seemed to linger longer on the walls, as if reluctant to move on. Layla spent most of her time in the living room, reading through Caldwell's notebook again and again. She had begun to know his handwriting the way she knew Marcus's. Every loop and hurried mark, every faint tremor of exhaustion in the later pages. She could almost hear his voice now, patient but firm, a man writing not for recognition but for remembrance. Marcus, meanwhile, spent hours on the phone with Reed and a few archivists from Atlanta, helping them plan the transfer of the materials to a preservation lab. He had never been much of a talker, but when he spoke about Caldwell's work, something in his tone changed. He sounded proud, not in himself, but in the act of having helped history find its way home. 1 week later, a small van from the Georgia Historical Society arrived. The team was careful and professional, handling the negatives and photographs as if they were sacred relics. Marcus watched them pack each piece into foam-lined cases. When the last one was sealed and loaded, he felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness, as if part of the house itself had been gently lifted away. Yet, when he looked at Layla, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed against the sunlight, he could tell she felt something different. Not loss, but peace. That evening, after the van had disappeared down the road, they sat on the porch as dusk fell. The crickets had begun their song, and the oak tree at the end of the yard swayed gently in the fading light. Layla leaned against Marcus, her voice quiet. "It feels like the house is breathing easier now." He nodded, watching the horizon. Maybe it's been waiting for this, for someone to set the story free. The following morning, they received a call from Reed. His voice carried a kind of excitement that cut through the static of the phone line. "They developed one of the film rolls," he said. "It's in better condition than anyone expected. You both need to see this." They drove into town again, the road winding through fields of golden grass and past clusters of trees still heavy with late summer leaves. Reed met them outside the small community center that had been transformed almost overnight into a temporary exhibition space. Inside, several panels had been set up, each displaying enlarged prints from Caldwell's recovered negatives. The sight stopped them both at the door. The photographs were breathtaking, not in the polished way of studio portraits, but in their rawness, their humanity. There were children holding hands at marches, women singing in church basements, men standing in the rain with signs held high. Some of the images were filled with joy, others with exhaustion or grief, but all of them pulsed with life. The emotion in each face was so vivid that it felt as though the room itself was humming with the echoes of their voices. Layla moved slowly from one print to another, her hand covering her mouth. She stopped before an image of a young woman standing before a line of police officers, her chin lifted, her eyes fierce. Behind her, others held signs that read, "We shall not be moved." Layla's eyes welled with tears. "She looks like she could be my aunt," she whispered. "Or me." Marcus didn't answer. His gaze had fallen on a different photograph, one that showed a man with a camera around his neck, caught mid-step, a faint smile on his face. The caption below it read simply, James Caldwell, 1965, photo by unknown participant. He was seeing, for the first time, the man whose hands had buried the truth they had unearthed. There was something hauntingly familiar about Caldwell's expression, calm, determined, and quietly proud. Reed joined them, his eyes gleaming with restrained excitement. "We're organizing an exhibition," he explained. "A proper one with historians, journalists, students. The museum in Atlanta wants to make it permanent. They're calling it The Eyes of Caldwell." For a long time, neither Marcus nor Layla could speak. The thought that their chance discovery in a forgotten yard had brought a man's name back into history seemed almost unreal. Yet it had happened, and the evidence was right there in front of them, each photograph a voice that had once been silenced, now singing again. Over the next few weeks, word spread quickly. Newspapers picked up the story. News stations called for interviews. People came from neighboring towns and even from other states to see the images. Some visitors recognized faces in the photographs: an uncle, a grandmother, a neighbor long passed away. Others simply stood in silence, their eyes reflecting the flicker of recognition that comes when the past speaks directly to the present. During one of the early exhibitions, a frail woman in her 70s approached Layla and Marcus. She carried a small handbag and wore a faded scarf around her shoulders. Her eyes were sharp, the color of storm clouds. "You're the couple who found his work?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Layla nodded. "Yes, ma'am. We found it buried behind our house. We didn't even know who he was until we started reading his notes." The woman smiled faintly. "I knew James Caldwell," she said. "I was a student when he came through our town with that camera. Folks warned him to be careful. They said he was drawing too much attention to himself, but he never stopped. He said the world had to see us, all of us." I remember him standing right in front of the sheriff's dogs, clicking that camera like he wasn't afraid of anything. Her eyes grew distant, and she touched one of the prints gently, her fingers tracing the image of a crowd with raised fists. "He told me once that photographs were the only way to make silence speak, and now," her voice broke slightly, "now he's speaking again." When she left, Layla stood there for a long while, her heart full and aching all at once. She thought of Caldwell, of the weight he had carried, of the courage it must have taken to keep going even when the world turned against him. His story was no longer buried. It was blooming, growing, reaching into the lives of people who had forgotten that their struggle had once been seen through his lens. In the evenings, after the visitors left and the exhibition lights were dimmed, Marcus and Layla would stay behind to help Reed pack up. They liked the quiet of those moments, the echo of footsteps on the wooden floor, the way the photographs seemed to glow faintly in the low light. One night, as they were preparing to leave, Marcus noticed something new on the wall. A blown-up scan of a letter that had been found folded in the back of Caldwell's notebook. It was addressed to no one in particular. The ink was faint but legible. "If you find this, you have found me. I could not save everything, but I hope you save enough. The light belongs to whoever keeps it alive." Marcus stared at the words until they blurred. Layla came to stand beside him, reading them quietly. "He was talking to us," she said. Back at the house, the yard felt different now. It was no longer haunted by questions, but blessed by purpose. The oak tree under which Caldwell had hidden his life's work had become a symbol of endurance. They decided not to disturb the spot again. Instead, Marcus built a small wooden bench there, simple and unadorned. Layla planted a ring of wildflowers around the base, lavender, daisies, and small white asters. Every evening, as the sun sank behind the horizon, the light would touch the petals and make them shimmer like embers. One night, after returning from another exhibition event, they sat on the bench together. The air was cool, the grass whispering softly around them. The moon rose above the fields, silver and watchful. Marcus leaned back, exhaling deeply. "Do you ever think," he said, "that maybe we didn't just find this? Maybe it found us?" Layla smiled faintly. Maybe it waited until someone would listen." They sat in silence after that, listening to the night sounds, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of crickets, the faint hum of life returning to the soil. The house behind them glowed warmly through its windows, no longer a stranger's home, but a keeper of memory. In the months that followed, the story of James Caldwell spread far beyond Pine Hollow. Documentaries were made, books were written, and scholars cited his recovered work as one of the most important visual records of the civil rights movement. The photographs were displayed in museums across the country. In every gallery, the caption beneath each image read, "Recovered in Pine Hollow, Georgia by Marcus and Layla Johnson, 2025. When the museum in Atlanta opened the permanent exhibition, they invited the couple as guests of honor. As they walked through the glass doors and into the vast hall filled with images they now knew by heart, Layla felt a lump form in her throat. The walls were covered with light and shadow, hundreds of lives frozen in time, now finally seen. Near the entrance, a single enlarged portrait of Caldwell hung alone, illuminated by a narrow beam of light. Beneath it, a plaque bore his final words, "The light belongs to whoever keeps it alive." Layla reached for Marcus's hand. "He's home," she said softly. Marcus nodded, his eyes glistening. "And so are we." That night, when they returned to Pine Hollow, the town was asleep, and their house stood quiet under the stars. The air smelled faintly of rain and earth. As they stepped onto the porch, the boards creaked familiarly beneath their feet. Layla paused, listening. Somewhere in the distance, thunder murmured, low and distant, like a drumbeat fading into memory. She looked toward the oak tree and smiled. It was no longer just a tree. It was a monument, not of marble or stone, but of silence, patience, and truth. Its roots reached deep into the same earth that had once hidden the photographs, and now it stood as a guardian over what had been returned to the world. Inside, Marcus turned off the lights, and the house fell into darkness, but it was a peaceful darkness, alive with memory. The faint hum in the walls, the quiet sigh of the wood as it settled, all of it felt like breathing. The story of James Caldwell had become part of their story now, a thread that would stretch beyond them, carried by those who came after. And in that quiet moment, as the wind brushed softly through the trees, Layla closed her eyes and whispered a promise to keep the light alive, always. The house, as if hearing her, creaked gently in reply. By the time autumn came to Pine Hollow, the leaves around the old house had turned to gold and copper, the air cooling in the evenings until the windows fogged lightly from the warmth within. The long, hot summer that had carried Marcus and Layla through discovery, revelation, and remembrance was finally giving way to quiet. The days were shorter now, but there was a peace to them, a rhythm that the couple had grown to love. The story of James Caldwell had spread far beyond the boundaries of their small town, and yet the house, their house, had remained the same. Steadfast, gentle, filled with the smell of coffee in the mornings and the whisper of the oak tree at night. Every few weeks someone would still drive up the gravel path and knock on their door. A journalist, a student, a historian, each one carrying questions about the discovery, the photographs, or Caldwell himself. Marcus and Layla always welcomed them in with tea or coffee, answering what they could, though neither of them pretended to be experts. They told the story the way they remembered it. The cables, the digging, the first glimpse of the rusted box, and the moment the truth had unfolded in their hands. They never embellished it, never romanticized it, yet every time they spoke, the story seemed to grow on its own, like the roots of the oak spreading deeper underground. The first snow of the season fell early that year, a thin dusting that turned the yard pale beneath the moonlight. Marcus stood by the window that evening, watching the flakes drift through the light of the porch lamp. It was strange, he thought, how quiet the world could be after everything they had witnessed. The wind moved softly through the bare branches, and for the first time since they'd found the box, he realized he no longer felt the weight of mystery pressing on him. The land was at rest. Layla joined him, slipping her arm through his. "It's beautiful," she said. Her voice was soft, and there was something tender in the way she looked at the snow-covered yard, the oak tree, the bench, the faint mound where the earth had once been disturbed. "It feels like it's finally finished. Or maybe just begun," Marcus said quietly. They had received word the week before that the permanent Caldwell exhibition in Atlanta was now open to the public. The museum director had sent them an invitation to the opening ceremony, complete with printed programs featuring their names alongside Caldwell's. But Marcus and Layla hadn't gone. They had thought about it, even packed a bag once. But in the end, they couldn't bring themselves to leave the house that had given the story back to the world. Instead, they chose to stay here, where it had all begun, where the memory still lived in the soil and the walls. In late November, a group of school children came on a field trip organized by the Pine Hollow Historical Society. Reed accompanied them, now a dear friend of the couple, his once formal tone softened by months of shared purpose. The children, curious and bright-eyed, crowded around the oak tree as he told them the story, how a photographer had captured the spirit of an era, how his work had vanished, and how two ordinary people had found it again. Layla watched from the porch, smiling as the children asked questions, their voices high and eager. One little girl raised her hand and asked if Caldwell had been a hero. Reed thought for a moment, then said, "He was a man who believed that truth deserves a home, and sometimes that makes you a hero." Later, after everyone had left, the house felt alive in a way that was hard to describe. The laughter of the children seemed to linger in the air, mixing with the scent of the wildflowers that had dried beneath the first frost. Marcus walked down to the oak and ran his hand along the rough bark. The roots beneath him stretched deep into the ground, their hidden strength reminding him of the box, the film, the courage it had taken for one man to bury his truth so that it might survive. That evening, Layla lit a candle on the kitchen table. The soft glow reflected in the glass of the framed photograph that now hung above the fireplace, a portrait of James Caldwell restored from one of his surviving negatives. His face was calm, his eyes bright and knowing. It had become a part of the house now, as much as the floorboards, the windows, and the air itself. They ate dinner quietly that night, listening to the faint crackle of the fire. Every once in a while, Marcus would glance at the photograph, half expecting it to flicker, as if Caldwell himself were moving behind the glass. He didn't believe in ghosts, not in the way people told stories about them, but he believed in presence, the kind that lived in objects, in places, in memory, and this house, he knew, was filled with it. When the phone rang, Layla answered. It was Reed again, calling from Atlanta. "You two should see this," he said, excitement in his voice. "The museum's opening drew hundreds of people. But that's not the best part. They found something else, a roll of undeveloped film tucked in one of the camera bodies. It must have been overlooked before. They developed it yesterday." Layla's heart skipped. What was on it? Reed hesitated for a beat, then said, "Caldwell himself, standing right here in Pine Hollow beside the oak. It's the last photo he ever took. Looks like he set the camera up on a tripod. He's holding a shovel in one hand. He must have taken it just before he buried everything." For a long moment, neither Layla nor Marcus spoke. Reed's words settled in like the quiet after a song. When she hung up, Layla turned to Marcus, her eyes shimmering. "He left us one last picture," she said. The museum sent them a print of the image a week later. When they unwrapped it, both stood in silence. There he was, James Caldwell, in black and white, his face illuminated by the faint morning light. Behind him stood the very tree that now towered in their yard, smaller then, but unmistakable. His expression was serene, as though he knew exactly what he was doing, as though he trusted time to bring his story home. Layla framed the photograph and hung it in the hallway opposite the front door. It was the first thing visitors would see when they entered the house, and the last thing they would notice before leaving. Sometimes, when she passed by it at night, she thought she could almost sense his presence there. A quiet watchfulness, not haunting but protective. As winter deepened, the days slowed further. The snow came and went, blanketing the yard in silence. Marcus spent more time repairing the small shed by the fence, turning it into a workspace where he could tinker with old tools. Layla began writing, filling notebooks with thoughts about their discovery, about how chance and kindness could alter the course of forgotten lives. She wrote not for publication but for clarity, to remind herself of what had happened and what it had meant. One evening, just after dusk, a gentle knock sounded at the door. When Marcus opened it, a man stood there holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. He introduced himself as Thomas Caldwell, James's grandnephew. He had learned of the discovery from the museum and had come to see the place for himself. His face carried traces of his ancestor, the same deep eyes, the same quiet composure. They invited him in, shared coffee, and talked long into the evening. Thomas told them about family stories passed down through generations, how James had been the black sheep, the dreamer who vanished without explanation. No one had ever known what had become of him. But now, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, we do, and we know what he stood for. When he left, Marcus and Layla stood in the doorway, watching his car disappear down the long drive. The house felt larger somehow, more complete. The circle had closed. The past had found its way home. In the spring that followed, the field around the house came alive again. The wildflowers Layla had planted spread further, blooming in waves of color that reached all the way to the edge of the property. The oak tree grew fuller, its leaves whispering in every breeze. Visitors still came, but fewer now. Students writing papers, travelers passing through, families who wanted to see the place where the buried truth had been found. Marcus and Layla never turned anyone away. They would show them the bench, the spot beneath the tree, the framed photographs, and tell the story again as though it were the first time. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, Layla would sit on the porch with her tea and watch the sun rise over the fields. She would think about how strange life was, how two people searching for a home had found something far greater than property, something that had changed not just their lives, but the lives of countless others. The house had given them purpose. It had made them keepers of a story that needed to be told. One evening in late summer, they hosted a small gathering to commemorate the anniversary of the discovery. Reed came, as did Thomas Caldwell and a few neighbors who had become friends. They sat outside under the oak tree, lanterns hanging from its branches, the air warm and full of the scent of grass and earth. Reed gave a short speech about memory, about how the past lives on not in grand monuments, but in the quiet acts of people who choose to remember. When he finished, there was a moment of silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves overhead. Layla looked around the circle of faces glowing in the lantern light, friends, strangers, descendants, and herself, and felt a deep calm settle over her. Marcus reached for her hand. They didn't need to say anything. They had done what they were meant to do. Later that night, after everyone had gone, they lingered beneath the tree. The lantern swayed gently, casting moving shadows across the yard. Marcus looked up through the branches to where the stars shimmered faintly between the leaves. "You ever wonder," he said quietly, "what the house remembers of us?" Layla smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Everything," she said. "It remembers the laughter, the work, the fear, the hope. It remembers him, and it'll remember us too." The wind stirred again, lifting the scent of flowers and the faint creak of the porch steps. The house behind them stood in the moonlight, weathered but strong, its windows glowing softly. Somewhere within its walls, history still breathed, the hum of wires, the whisper of pages, the echo of a camera shutter frozen in time. As the night deepened, they stayed there beneath the oak, listening to the quiet heartbeat of the land. The house, the tree, the buried box, the photographs, each was part of the same story now, a story of resilience, remembrance, and faith in what survives. And though decades would pass and new hands would someday touch its doors, the house would go on holding those memories, keeping them safe in its bones. For that was what it had always done and what it would always do. The house remembered. It always would. If this story gave you chills, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Check out the other mysteries waiting on the channel and share this video with someone who loves a good secret uncovered.